Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Airport lines grow as TSA agents leave, and yesterday's special elections in Florida give Democrats two key victories. Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, we talk about the growing travel crush, as well as a slate of local legislative priorities that did and did not pass in our monthly conversation with government expert and Jacksonville attorney Chris Hand. Later in the program, a rare photo essay of Black Jacksonville in the 1930s. But first, we're joined as we are each month by attorney, author, and local government expert Chris Hand to help us make sense of the world. Good morning, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Ann. Happy final few days of March, hard as that is to believe.
It is astonishing.
Yeah.
Time flies. Well, it's great to have you back. And I do want to get into the issue at the airports. But before we do, let's talk about a couple of elections yesterday here in Florida. Two districts flipped from Republican held to Democrat. Tell us about those elections. They were two of three that were in Florida yesterday that were of some consequence.
Very unanticipated results, and that I think speak a lot to what the national political environment is at the moment, and one that is not positive for the party that controls the White House and both houses of Congress. You had two legislative seats that had received some attention. One was Senate District 14, which is in the Tampa area. That's the seat that was formerly held by Lieutenant Governor Jay Collins before he was appointed to that seat. This was a special election to fill it. A state representative, Josie Tomkow, was running for the Republicans. Brian Nathan, sort of a unknown candidate for the Democrats. He won in a very surprising upset last night by just a few hundred votes. That was a district, Ann, that in the 2024 election went for President Trump by about 7 percentage points. It's roughly that same amount in terms of voter registration. Republicans have about a 7 to 9% voter registration advantage in that district. So that was a swing district. I think even more surprising, or maybe as surprising to some, House District 87, which is in Palm Beach County, which is actually President Trump's home district. In fact, he voted by mail in this election. That was an election where Emily Gregory, the Democrat, beat the Republican candidate by about 3 percentage points in a district that President Trump had won by 11% in 2024. Again, about the same voter registration advantage for Republicans. So I think if you look at both of those races, they tell us a lot about what the national environment is right now. In both cases, the Democratic candidates were outspent. In the case of the Senate race, massively outspent. But I think voters are very frustrated at the moment. They have high gas prices in a lot of parts of Florida. Gas has now gone over $4 a gallon. High prices in the grocery store, high prices for health care, of course, long lines at airports, opposition to the war in Iran. It's a very difficult national environment right now for the Republicans who control Congress and the presidency and the Florida legislature. I think we saw that seep into these special election results last night.
Sure, and those Democrats ran on affordability. That's kind of been the message of Democrats this midterm upcoming election cycle. Both of those seats were opened after Governor Ron DeSantis made appointments, sort of shuffling people out of those seats. One was appointing, as you said, Senator Jay Collins to be lieutenant governor. The other, Mike Caruso, was appointed clerk of the court. Does that just sort of speak to the precarity of some districts? Is there any significance to the choices that the governor made in pulling people from those seemingly safe seats?
Well, I think probably there was a calculation that those seats were safe, right? And that if there was a special election, those were less likely to turn over. I think when the governor made those selections, which was quite some time ago, right? These seats have been open for months at this point. It was a different political environment than it is right now. And even on election day, there was some thought that Emily Gregory could prevail in Palm Beach County, but almost no thought that Brian Nathan would prevail in that Senate district in the Tampa area, just because he had, again, a very well-funded, well-liked opponent in Josie Tomkow. And she'll be running again in the November election, and maybe the same in the state house race again. But I think there was a different political environment, and one where there wasn't an anticipated flip. We now see kind of where, the political winds are blowing. And I think what's particularly noteworthy about these races, and there'll be more analysis in the days to come as people dive into the results, but I think one immediate takeaway is the voting behavior of NPA, no party affiliation voters. They appear to have broken strongly for Democrats. Of course, this is after a 2024 where they broke for Republicans,
Okay.
and were able to prevail in a number of races. So the key to any contested race is usually NPAs. Who controls that vote? They're the fastest growing voting bloc in Florida. They're often decisive in these elections. It appears they were yet again decisive in these two special elections last night.
And Florida is now part of a national pattern that we've seen, including in some other conservative places, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, where races that have been pretty secure GOP seats have flipped, now going on maybe 30 in state legislatures over the past 12 or 14 months. So is are Republicans going to be responding to this in a specific way? What kind of strategy will they be formulating, guided by some of these surprise losses?
I think it'll potentially impact both kind of legislative strategy, but also political strategy as well. And I think it is important to provide some caution about these special election results. These are sort of moments in time in individual places. And I think sometimes it can be very hard to draw broader conclusions about, say, what's going to happen in the November general election. That's months away. A lot can happen between now and then. And that's an election where political parties are focusing their entire turnout infrastructure, every dollar they have into the election. So they're different elections that we're going to see in November. So I think it's a little bit tricky to be able to draw longer term conclusions. I do think it gives us a snapshot in time about how the political environment is at the moment and what voters are feeling. At this moment in time, again, where gas prices are high because of the war in Iran, because people are seeing hours-long line at airports, at TSA checkpoints, where people are dealing with massive increases in healthcare costs because of the end of some of the Obamacare subsidies at the end of 2025. A lot of these forces are converging, and these are opportunities for voters to express their displeasure with those, and they are doing so, not just in Florida, but as you say, in other states.
Well, I do want to talk about the airport situation, but if you're just joining us, we are talking to state and local political headlines with government expert and analyst Chris Hand, and you can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. If you've experienced any waits or delays yourself, you can also go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us on social. So let's talk about these delays, Chris. We're hearing anecdotally, certainly from people we know that have been in airports recently, some reporting also being done, in fact, a lot. And we're hearing of 5-hour waits at Houston Bush. On the weekend, I heard reports of a 9-hour wait at Atlanta Hartsfield. Some people missing flights, a lot of people quite upset, lines stretching over multiple concourses, multiple floors. So what is the bigger picture that's happening right now with the TSA and these enormous lines?
This all comes down to funding of the Department of Homeland Security. And as you know, this is the second shutdown of a kind we've experienced really just in the last sort of 6 months here in this country. But every federal department is now funded except for the Department of Homeland Services and Homeland Security. And in mid-February, the funding for DHS lapsed. Really over the issue of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Of course, people are familiar with a lot of the controversy surrounding ICE, from mass deportations to the shooting and killing of 2 American citizens that occurred in Minnesota during sort of the massive ICE presence that occurred there. Democrats in both the House and the Senate have been demanding reforms to ICE, including no longer having ICE agents wear masks, and also ensuring that to the extent ICE removes anybody, it's done via what's called a judicial warrant, a warrant issued by a court, as opposed to an administrative warrant, a warrant that's somehow issued by the Department of Homeland Security
Sort
itself.
of issued to itself.
Correct, that's right. And so that's sort of been the stalemate in terms of funding. There's been a lot of back and forth over that issue. Remember that ICE was largely pre-funded in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill in 2025. Congress included a fairly large appropriation.
70
for ICE
billion-ish, right?
That's right, yeah. So they're still operating. They haven't shut down because they have that funding available. But the lack of funding to DHS in general affects agencies like the Transportation Security Administration, the checkpoints at airports, like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Coast Guard, other agencies that are part of DHS. So that has been something of a funding stalemate. over the last kind of 6 weeks or so since, or really last kind of month or 5 weeks since the middle of February. It appears there may now be a potential compromise in the offing where one thing the Democrats have been offering for a while is to fund everything in the Department of Homeland Security except
Except,
for ICE and some other kind of immigration enforcement parts of the agency. And that offer has largely been rejected. But it looks like that direction in which the compromise is now headed, where Congress may add a standalone appropriations bill that would fund everything in the Department of Homeland Security except ICE, and then they would approach ICE funding through what's called the reconciliation process. Once a year, Congress is permitted to pass budget and spending items on a simple majority vote. The filibuster doesn't apply to that. And so it appears that what Republicans in Congress are going to try and do, pass everything now via compromise with the Democrats except ICE, and then pass that in a separate legislative vehicle. There's not an agreement on that yet. There's going back and forth between Republicans and Democrats still, but Congress is due to take its Easter recess at the end of this week, where they'll be gone for about 10 days through the Easter holiday. So there's a big push on the part of members of both houses of Congress to try and get this resolved. As one member of Congress put it, I think it was the Senate Majority Leader John Thune put it well, no one wants to go home over Easter break and explain this to their constituents. So there does seem to be a big push now to try and resolve this week.
well, I'm sure they don't want to go home to their districts and have to wait in these long lines like everybody else.
That too.
And that's actually something that we were discussing a little before the show, which is sort of this pretty obvious move by Delta Airlines to kind of drive home the point, removing some perks that they offer to members of Congress, including speedy transport to the gate, sort of an escort that can get you past lines, past security. They publicly rescinded that offer. And as you noted, it wasn't widely known that they even offered that.
Yeah, that was less of a rescinding more than it was a global announcement that they had been providing those before. And the kind of thing that I think certainly puts added pressure on members of Congress to resolve this. I mean, as Delta said in its announcement, there was a perk where they had a dedicated help desk for members of Congress. They could book on multiple flights without penalty in case, the vote schedule changed, and you talked about some of the escorts to gates. These perks were not widely known around the country. They are widely known now, and I'm sure is a subject of massive communication from constituents to members of Congress, and put some added pressure on members of Congress to try and resolve this before, as quickly as possible so these lines can go away.
So speaking of pressure, when the president first floated the idea of sending ICE agents to airports, it was not a neutral statement. I mean, it was presented almost as a threat, but they're there now and patrolling, apparently not alleviating lines very much by their presence. This agency, though, becoming sort of increasingly a tool available to the president to use in a variety of settings. And it is curious to have this one Department of Homeland Security agency getting paid to be at the airports, while this other agency of the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA agents, going now on their second, about to receive their, if it remains in a stalemate, their second missed paycheck, full paycheck at the end of this week.
Well, and I think very important to remember that, TSA officers are real people with real lives and real financial obligations. And there's a lot of kind of suffering occurring among TSA agents. There are some communities, Pembroke Park down in South Florida has, for example, organized a food drive for TSA agents. Mm-hmm. There have been a variety of suggestions about could they be, funded by other means. Other communities have rallied. So, I mean, it's a significant problem, obviously, to have to show up to one's job and now not get paid for it for multiple weeks in a row makes it very hard for people to satisfy their financial obligations, and I think has added to the sort of pressure atmosphere of this crisis. Part of the reason we're seeing some of the long lines is that, understandably, you've got large numbers of TSA officers who are not showing up for work any day. And you look at these statistics, and on any given day, you've got between 30 to 40% of TSA officers who are calling in sick. And that could be for a variety of reasons. They might have to, do something else to generate income during this period, but it's what's adding to this situation. So, I mean, I think that's one thing really important to keep in mind. There's a lot of inconvenience for travelers, and that's something of concern, but there's also, people's livelihoods on the line here. To your point about ICE, this is not within ICE's ambit. the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement has nothing to do with security at airports. And frankly, for a variety of reasons, airports are probably the last place or one of the last places you would expect to have large numbers of kind of undocumented immigrants coming into the country because of all the sort of identification requirements that are, identification is required to come through a U.S. airport. So it is curious to see ICE used in this situation. As you say, it doesn't appear they're sort of being used as replacement, personnel to kind of help alleviate some of these challenges there. So it's a little bit curious why ICE is involved. It's not widespread. It's been, I think, at maybe less than 15 airports around the country right now. Here in Florida, the only airport I know where they've been deployed is in Southwest Florida at Fort Myers. That airport there, not in Orlando, not in some other places. That list may have expanded, but just as this started earlier this week, it was a very small number of airports, and it's not entirely clear what they're doing there.
Yeah, and we haven't heard reports of them here in Jacksonville. I want to ask you about the role of TSA agents, because obviously, as you say, they're real people. This is the second time in less than a year that they've had to go weeks without getting paid for their work, which is, whether they're staying home to provide childcare that they can no longer afford or to pick up some gig work to pay for their rent and other expenses. They're hurting. But they're often a very valuable tool, just in the crassest sense, when it comes to forcing legislators to the table, because people cannot tolerate disruptions to the transportation system. It becomes sometimes the only thing that brings negotiators to the table and forces some sort of deal between partisan lawmakers. What is the I just kind of want to ask you about that, because it does feel like they've been asking to be exempted in some ways from these kinds of debates so that they would have guaranteed funding, which is fair, it seems, to the people who hold these jobs. And yet, if they were exempted, that one tool that sometimes forces agreement would be no longer in the toolbox.
Well, I mean, you're right. The last two shutdowns have probably kind of pivoted largely on the fact that TSA agents aren't getting paid and that there are these long lines at airports as a result. It really is not sort of a best practice in terms of governing, as you can imagine, that to have that be the case. And in fact, that it's occasioned a lot of debate, Anne, as you've probably seen, about how we should do this going forward. There are those who say, as you have kind of relayed, that maybe we should have this in a situation where TSA is paid in a different way, so it's not sort of contingent on, this kind of congressional back and forth. There have been some, Governor Ron DeSantis is one of them, who have suggested that TSA be privatized, right. That they not be federal employees, that these be, done by contractors. So again, they're not as sort of reliant on the congressional appropriation cycle. Clearly, that's not sustainable long term. I mean, the traffic at U.S. airports is not getting any smaller. I think people, obviously increasingly use U.S. airports to get to various points in the country. Not sustainable over the long term, particularly not sustainable from a recruitment and retention standpoint, right? I mean, that if you're someone who's a prospective TSA agent, someone who thinks that this might be something you might want to do in the future, the events of the last 6 months have probably been a major discouragement of that potential career, because you see that you could get caught in the middle of congressional appropriations fight. So I think for the long-term sustainability of the agency, it is going to be important to find new ways to approach this, because it's very important. We have people who want to be TSA officers, who are well-trained, who are well-qualified for that. And if you send out this massive signal that says, don't apply unless you're comfortable with having missed paychecks at various times just because members of Congress aren't getting along, I think that's going to have a real chilling effect on people applying to the agency.
I thought it was interesting, too, that the governor, in talking about his thoughts of privatizing or allowing the airports or the airlines to run this service, suggested that TSA hasn't made air travel any safer, which I thought was sort of an unusual platform to take. I think a lot of people believe that they have, although it has come with certain inconveniences, the shoes and the delays. And we know that people are now required to get to the airport considerably earlier than they used to. If you're joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand. We'd love to hear from you. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or go to firstcoastconnect.org. We do have an email from Ricardo just saying, great to hear Ann and Chris together. Always good to hear them every month. We also have a message from Tom on Facebook saying the special election results clearly show what happens when a president breaks his promise to his base. And from Brenda on Facebook, is Congress getting paid during the shutdown? Is there staff? Good question.
Yes, the congressional appropriations bill has been funded. Like I said, the only appropriation that has not yet been funded is the Department of Homeland Security. So this is not like past shutdowns. And I may have mentioned this on a previous show. During one of the earliest shutdowns in 1995, when I was a brand new congressional staffer, I was furloughed. I was one of those folks who who was not being paid for, sort of had to go home and not being paid for that work. So, yes, but that is not a situation with this shutdown. The only affected department is the Department of Homeland Security. Congress has been funded, so both members of Congress and their staffs are being paid, although one perk of the job of Congress, as you noted, has gone away. That's the sort of the Delta help desk and other amenities.
They do eventually get retroactive pay, correct?
That's typically the case in shutdowns, that there is sort of an appropriation that goes in to make sure that people who have been furloughed get paid for the time they were either furloughed or, in the case of TSA officers, paid for the time they worked and did not get paid. In fact, during the last shutdown, I believe the Department of Homeland Security even gave some bonuses to TSA officers who didn't miss any time during that period. And so, yes, typically they are paid. I mean, they don't make these decisions. That's decisions made by members of Congress and the president. So traditionally, the approach has been to hold federal employees harmless from those decisions.
Good question. Keep them coming. That's why Chris Hand is here. I do want to move on now, Chris, to talk about the legislative session, because you and I have not had a chance to sit down about that since it ended. This was a session with sort of a few hits and a lot of misses, including the one constitutional responsibility that these two bodies have, which is to pass a budget.
How many times do we have to bring up that you had one job meme in this discussion? But that's kind of where we are again. As Yogi Berra might have said, it's deja vu all over again. We're in the exact same position we were a year ago, where the House and the Senate were unable to agree on a final budget during the legislative session, and we'll have to go to overtime. Now, the difference from last year is I don't think they'll have to go as deep into overtime. This won't be 3 overtimes. It might just be one. It sounds like there's some optimism they'll be able to reach agreement. Right now, they're about $1.5 billion apart. The Senate has a budget of about $115 billion. The House about $113.5. That's a very large amount of money, but it does seem a bit less contentious than it was a year ago. Both the Senate President and the House Speaker are suggesting that they'll come back in April to put the finishing touches on the budget and hopefully resolve it then. So if it's finished in April this year, that will be a considerable improvement over June, which is when they finished it in 2025. But yes,
and they have to by July 1, right?
That is right. Or the Florida government will shut down, or at least have a partial government shutdown. So that is going into overtime. But it's not the only thing that's going into overtime. They did not, while the House passed a proposed amendment on property taxes, the Senate did not. So it sounds like they're going to try and address that in a special session at some point. Probably not in April, maybe later than in April. And they're already scheduled to come back April the 20th for a special session on redistricting. It will be very interesting to see if last night's special election results impact the thinking on that congressional redistricting. I think talking about chilling effects, I think that could really discourage any further redistricting efforts in Florida, seeing kind of what the environment might look like.
Let's talk about why that is. I mean, if a Republican is in a district that they think is safe and it's facing a new line, new boundaries, why might that make them why might they be concerned about that?
Well, just because of the national, if you redraw districts, you have to take, if you're going to draw new districts, you have to take voters from other districts. That often has the effect of making districts less safe and more marginal. And look, remember, the two districts that flipped last night, one was a Trump plus 11 district in 2024. The other was a Trump 7 plus 7.5 district in 2024. Those are, districts that should be relatively safe. You begin to dilute other districts out there, then, I think people will be concerned about what happens in November. There's already been reports.
Because just to be clear, this redistricting isn't just moving boundaries. It would be creating additional districts. So they'd have to find the people in those districts and cull them from adjacent districts.
That's right. Yeah, we'd have the same number of total districts in Florida, but we'd be sort of reallocating people kind of among districts here in the state.
So it wouldn't be a net increase in the number of districts.
No, because we do that every year every 10 years in terms of the Congress,
Gotcha.
in terms of the census is when reapportionment occurs,
Okay.
when states get either more or fewer districts than they have in the past. Florida would have the same number of districts as it did, say, in the 2024 election, but what those districts look like could be different depending on the legislature's redistricting efforts. I think it's increasingly possible that the result of the redistricting session may be nothing, that the legislature could come back and do what's called a gavel in and gavel out of that session, just because I think there's going to be increasing concern about the political environment. Again, it's been reported that a variety of Republican congressional incumbents are already not real excited about the idea of redistricting. It's also, I think there's some legal issues as well in terms of when qualifying has to happen for some of these races. That's typically in April. There'd been some suggestion they would try and move it back to June, but that's likely to be the subject of a legal challenge as well. So I think there's an increasing amount of questions and controversy about a potential redistricting effort. And of course, it has not necessarily worked out as people thought in other places. In some states, they rejected it outright, like Indiana. In Texas, they redrew a number of new districts, but now it appears like some of those are going to be much more in play in the November elections than people thought. So the law of unintended consequences very much comes into play as it relates to redistricting, particularly in the kind of national political environment we're seeing right now. So, again, it's possible the legislature could move forward, but I think it's equally possible they could decide that, this might have been a good idea a few months ago, but really isn't anymore.
This is the first time I've heard the term widely used of dummymandering, which is gerrymandering when it sort of backfires on the party that is advancing the idea of redistricting in order to get gains. Florida is unique in that you're not allowed to redistrict for partisan reasons. And the governor has said we need to do this, not for partisan reasons, but because the Supreme Court is going to be making a consequential decision about how districts are drawn to include minorities and whether that is, in fact, a kind of reverse racism. That decision was supposed to come perhaps in April, they have to, I guess, usually do it by June. But now it looks like the legislature could actually be ahead of the game before a decision is made, which doesn't that complicate the governor's rationale that we have to do this because the Supreme Court is going to decide thus, and so we don't have a decision?
Yes, I think it does complicate it. I think also because a number of Supreme Court watchers who have been asked about this have said that they think it is unlikely that a decision on the Voting Rights Act comes before the end of the term, which you say is in June. So, and certainly the legislature cannot be in the business for a variety of legal reasons of trying to redraw districts over the summer. At that point, you're really past any of the potential qualifying deadlines. You haven't given voters enough time to sort of know what district they're in. That's massively complicating for supervisors of elections around the state. So you're right. I mean, that rationale, again, unless the court, in a surprise to some of these, longtime Supreme Court observers, acts before April 20th, the legislature's redistricting is going to be somewhat in a vacuum without knowing what the Supreme Court's going to ultimately decide on the Voting Rights Act. So, again, I think there's a lot of forces potentially pushing in the direction of not having a redistricting this year, but the special session is still on the books, so we'll certainly know a lot more come late April.
It sort of starts to make one wonder if a 60-day session is even just a fiction anymore, given the fact that there's all these special sessions scheduled after the conclusion of the regular session. But I want to ask you about property taxes in particular, because this is an issue that is going to be discussed by this legislature in April. And we know that there was a review by the Jacksonville council auditor, the city council auditor, that raised a lot of red flags about what a change to property taxes or perhaps a wholesale elimination of property taxes for homesteaded properties could mean for the budget here in Duval County. And it is kind of alarming.
It's a massive change. And just to sort of put this in some perspective, so as we mentioned earlier, the Florida House of Representatives has passed a proposed constitutional amendment on property taxes. The Senate has not yet. They're both required to do that for it to go on the ballot. But the House proposal would sort of gradually phase out property taxes on homestead properties, primary residences, over the next 10 years. The Jacksonville City Council Auditor's Office did an analysis on this and suggested that the fiscal impact to the city of Jacksonville would be close to $400 million a year. Right now, we have about a $2 billion general fund budget here in the city of Jacksonville. So roughly 20% of the budget would have to be cut or revenue raised in some way to make up some other way to kind of make up for that cut in property taxes. To describe that as a massive impact on local government would be a giant understatement.
Well, it's actually even more dramatic than that because as the council auditor pointed out, the proposal as it exists would prevent city governments, local governments from cutting salaries or budgets for first responders. First responders in Jacksonville already comprise more than half of that $2 billion budget. They have $1.2 billion totally off limits. And so that remaining budget that could be subject to this $400 million pullback is essentially, it would be almost half, about 40% of that budget.
Well, and of course, it's not just officers' salaries and those sorts of things. The city has very, very large pension obligations that it, contractually has to sort of satisfy each year. You can't really walk away from those. So you're right. It's a very small portion of a relatively small portion of the budget from which you're having to draw that $375 million. For example, Councilman Will Lanin, the way he described it, I think pretty aptly, he said, you could eliminate essentially all funding for nonprofits, any money we give for economic development incentives, make cuts at a variety of departments, and we're not even halfway there at that point. So that would be to call it a very difficult budget exercise. I was at City Hall, City of Jacksonville from 2011 to 2015, where every year's budget was tough. Those budgets would seem easy compared to what the city of Jacksonville would have to do in the event of that sort of property tax cut. And it's not just, we're obviously focused on Jacksonville because we're here, but you see those sorts of numbers replicated in city and county governments around the state. And just to sort of put kind of a practical application on those numbers so that we're talking about more than just numbers here, remember that local governments in Florida are what provides sort of the key core services that people often think of. So as you mentioned, police and fire, but those would be exempted. But parks, public works, economic development at times, a lot of the types of things
libraries.
that, garbage, waste pickup,
Right.
libraries, a lot of the types of government services that people use the most on a day-to-day basis are provided by local governments, and those would absolutely be impacted by a cut of that magnitude. So it's something that's of concern on the part of local governments, local communities around the state. Now, at the moment, again, all we have is a House-passed amendment. The Senate has not offered a proposal.
But
The
that
governor
means
has not offered a proposal.
our local lawmakers, our representatives in the House from Duval County and from this region have said yes, essentially, to this idea, or at least the majority party members have supported this in the House. Do you think they're hearing from the city council? I mean, it sounds like the city council is now going to go through an exercise where they try to dummy up a budget that would take into account these massive cuts. But it appears that even that exercise would require almost wholesale cuts to things like streets, drainage, public works, as you say, garbage service, the things that we don't even really think about, but potentially could be very noticeable for residents if they went away.
People would see the impact of this cut. This wouldn't be sort of a hidden cut where people think, well, government's just kind of gone on as it was. This is almost existential in many ways, again, both for the city of Jacksonville and for other city and county governments. Look, I think it's a very prudent exercise for any city and county government in Florida right now to be doing some immediate planning about what they're going to do in the event this passes. I don't think it's prudent to kind of wait and see what happens here because, again, yes, is it possible this won't ultimately go on the ballot? Yes. Is it possible voters won't approve it even if it does go on the ballot? Yes. Some polling suggests that maybe it's not quite at that 60% plus one standard that it needs to reach. But if I were a city or county government in Florida right now, I would be preparing for the worst case scenario because what you don't want to do is be in a situation come early November where this amendment has passed and you're suddenly sort of scrambling
Because
to put together a plan at that
this
point.
would impact the budget that has to be completed by Jacksonville in the fall if it were to pass. I just want to very briefly take a call. Jason, we just got about 30 seconds. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good morning. And this is one of the worst ideas. The Republican Party will stop at nothing to try and give a tax break to the wealthiest people in the world, and many of them live in Florida. A much better idea is simply to double the amount of the current homestead exemption to $100,000. That actually makes sense because real estate has improved a lot. But it makes no sense to give someone with a $50 million oceanfront property who they claim is their home a huge tax break, and then the tax break for the regular person that owns maybe a $200,000 home, while it is a tax break, it will not have the impact. This is a terrible idea. I hope we can get more pushback against it. Stop giving people like Rick Scott and Shad Khan just another enormous tax break. Thank you and have a great day.
Jason, thanks so much. And we are going to have to leave it there. Chris Hand, it's great to talk to you again. Thanks so much for coming on. And we look forward to following this issue and many others with you in the months ahead.
Plenty to talk about in April. See you then, Ann.
All right. We'll see you then. That's Chris Hand. Stick around. We'll be back in just a minute with a story about Black Jacksonville as we've never seen it before. Welcome back. A rare collection of recently unearthed photographs captures a previously unseen history of Jacksonville in the 1930s. Here to tell us how the collection came to light is one of the folks who helped bring it to light, Mitch Heyman, archivist at the Ritz Theatre and Museum in LaVilla. Mitch, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So this is a fascinating collection. Start maybe just by telling us where these pictures came from.
Well, I'll do my best. It's still kind of shrouded in mystery. I'll start with a news flash for all your listeners. We archivists love to travel in packs and get together and nerd out over history. So I knew Elaine, and I know Elaine Aiken, who's the archivist at Riverside Avondale Preservation, and I know her well. And but she had written this blog post, which many have seen recently, this photo essay regarding this sort of recently acquired collection of property appraisers' pages. They're loose pages, probably from a larger book or collection, 80 plus pages. And that's the first time I learned about it too, in reading this blog post. And it was fascinating because it sort of, she wrote about how it highlighted, these smaller communities and Black life in Jacksonville, which sort of inadvertently pops up in these pages. I was struck by that. But what was odd was, or what was hilarious and ironic, was that Elaine was in the process of leaving RAP and leaving Jacksonville. So she no longer lives in town. And
she's overseas now.
She's overseas, living in Scotland, I believe. And I contacted her right away and I said, did you know what this is all about and how important this collection is? This is a very valuable collection in so many ways. And it's just an interesting way to go out, essentially. So she said, well, yeah, talk to Shannon over at RAP and see what we can do. So I got in touch with her and I said, this is a really high value collection for many reasons. People who are local architectural historians, all types of historians, because it really covers like the whole sort of urban core and the suburban areas, not just Black neighborhoods. So it appeals to a lot of different types of scholars and historians, and I thought this is a very high valuable collection. It's going to need to be digitized. It's going to be in demand. I could sense that it would be in demand, and it already has been.
Sure.
So I thought this is a great way for the Ritz to partner once again with RAP. We've done several things before. I love working with them. So I made that offer, and I was able to take the collection to our digitization lab at the Ritz, get it scanned. It wasn't too many pages. It only took a day or two. And then we were able to share it more widely.
Sure.
That's really part of the point.
And I encourage people who can to turn on the live stream, because we're going to be showing some of these photographs. And one of the things that's really interesting about them is that they're not taken with any they're not trying to profile people. They're simply showcasing these various architectural styles. It is a classification system almost of the property appraisers. And so the descriptions, in most cases, you don't even know the address of the building. It's just telling you sort of the style, the materials that were used to make them. It doesn't even have a year.
That's right. Yeah, it's the pages themselves are really mainly focused on the type of structure and the type of material that was used to build them, and to create the sort of classification system, I guess, in terms of value, but it doesn't even give it a value. And you're right, there's no addresses, so it takes a bit of research. I have been able to locate and identify some of the structures, but it's in the text that things start to become more clear and interesting. Like what's attached to that is, in this classification system, running from A to F. So A is very high valuable bungalows in white neighborhoods. They describe the materials that are being used to build these structures are very high quality, and it trickles all the way down to F in LaVilla and other black neighborhoods in Jacksonville, and it starts to describe these apartment buildings as very cheaply made. Plumbing is an issue. Heating might be an issue. They might use a fireplace. And it sort of speaks to sort of this policy of redlining, this discriminatory redlining that was happening at the time. So it just adds to that narrative that these areas of town and properties were very low value and not worth investing in.
And some of the photos, including one that you found of your home, the Ritz Theatre, sort of surprised you because the look of the theater is perhaps not as we see it today with the big Ritz sign out in front. It doesn't have that sign.
That's right, exactly. I was intrigued by that photo. It was the one that I saw when I went to Wrap and actually thumbed through the pages initially. It just jumped out at me, and I was shocked to see it because a lot of people don't know this. There isn't a lot of documentary evidence of the Ritz and its history, which surprised me when I got to the Ritz. There's very little of it. So this image,
even though it was sort of seminal performance space for so many famous black musicians and entertainers.
Yeah, it was. It opened in 1929, and it had many decades of being open and operating up until the 1970s. However, it's just a series of events where the owner, when he passed away, it turns out it seems that a lot of the things that the physical things and evidence of this business were essentially thrown away, I believe. So there's very little of that. So for me to see a photo that I've dated around 1933 was the earliest photo I've ever seen of the Ritz. And so what it does is it asks a lot of new questions, like, where is that iconic sign that we've been reading about? It's not there yet. Several years after opening, we just have this flat billboard, which is sort of indicative of the time, featuring an Eddie Cantor film, A Kid from Spain, it was called. And so it kind of just makes you wonder, what do we know about the Ritz? There's still a lot to learn about the Ritz.
A lot to talk about. We're going to be back in just a minute. We're talking about a new collection that has been unearthed, and the archivist of that photo project, Mitch Heyman, will be back on the other side of a break in just a minute.
The Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens presents Art in Bloom, uniting nature and creativity with flowers made of glass, ceramics, paper, wood, and even Lego. On display through September 13th. More information available at cummermuseum.org. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
From the food we eat to what we watch, culture is everywhere, influencing our lives while reflecting our politics and economics.
The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible.
These spaces are where culture happens.
I am Netta Ulaby, and I report on arts, entertainment, and cultural trends for NPR. Invest in coverage that informs and illuminates by giving to this station today.
Visit us at wjct.org/radio.
The Strait of Hormuz has a unique geological history, a complex political history, and at present is at the center of a war that's disrupting energy supply chains all over the world.
The strait is never closed in modern times. It's always been able to flow.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. We'll talk about everything you wanted to know about the Strait of Hormuz, from how it formed to how it's become so critical to the global economy. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
The United States Post Time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I'm talking to Ritz Theatre and Museum archivist Mitch Heyman. We're talking about a new photo essay of Black Jacksonville in the 1930s. So, Mitch, are any of the people in these photos recognizable, or are they all just sort of passerby in a scene that is itself sometimes sort of anonymous?
I haven't noticed anyone in the photographs that could be identified. They're really, it's really quite just sort of a slice or a snapshot of an image all of a sudden on the streets. But I think that's what's so interesting is to see them present, to see individuals present in some of these photographs.
Natural settings and nothing staged about them.
Yeah, and the thing for me is, I've been doing this type of work for 20 plus years, and what I learned pretty early on was public history. There's sort of this ongoing legacy of erasure that occurs in the public history work and preservation work. And Betty Reed Soskin, who was a park ranger at the Rosie the Riveter National Park, and retired at 100 and passed away several months ago at 104. She was an amazing woman. She has a quote that I love, which is like, the people who get remembered, what gets remembered is determined by who's at the table doing the remembering. So often a lot of stories are left out. And the reason I talk about erasure is that these aren't really forgotten stories. I learned that pretty early on. It's like, these aren't forgotten stories. We didn't forget about them. We just sort of always chose not to remember them. And so to see these people and their lives in these neighborhoods, what I like to think about here is that these are ordinary lives probably, but they're also dignified still. An ordinary life is a dignified life. So to include them in the story of this city, I think, especially with America 250 happening now, it's great to see these sort of snapshots.
One of the things that this collection also captures are these images of the LaVilla area in its heyday, including Ashley Street in its prime, when there were theater after theater after theater. And I mean, not the Ritz, which was a couple blocks away, but the Strand and the Frolic and the Roosevelt, all of these just adjacent to each other, all of them showcasing, in many cases, Black vaudeville theater, Black films, sometimes called LaVilla's Great Black Way. So tell us about some of those images.
Oh, yeah, they're amazing. Ashley Street, or sometimes it was called the Stroll. It was really sort of our Beale Street, our Bourbon Street. It was a major entertainment hub, a big part of the Chitlin circuit in the early days, and movies. So the Strand Theater, there's a great photo in these pages of the Strand. There's a great photo of the Frolic. I don't think I've ever seen a photo of the Frolic. Both of these are on Ashley Street around Jefferson. Now LaVilla School for the Arts, the campus there. But in those days, it was just club after club after club, theaters. Jennifer's Hall is there, which was the Wynn Hotel, and the Lenape Bar below, places where Ray Charles really got a start in his teens, and it was just a real major thriving entertainment hub. The Strand itself, I know that the Wynn Hotel there on the corner across from Claire White Mission, that was the hotel of choice for Louis Armstrong, and he in the early days did perform pretty frequently at the Strand Theatre in those days. So he would love to stay there and stand up on the balcony and watch all the action below, versus some of the fancier hotels around the corner. But he just loved to be a part of the action. So it was just really an exciting sort of strip right here in Jacksonville happening, and we don't talk about it as much as some other cities do. You know, their own entertainment districts, but this was a major entertainment district, and it's worth talking about.
Yeah, and certainly this is a way to kind of profile that area and its history, because obviously, except for Genevars Hall and what the Clara White Mission occupies today, most of those buildings have been torn down and removed.
Yeah, actually, the Clara White Mission, people forget this, before it was the Mission, and it's still standing today happily, was the Globe Theater.
That's right.
It was owned by Frank Crowd, and it was one of the earliest in that area, and happily it's still standing.
And there's a museum inside that Mission building now that showcases that history. So just briefly, Mitch, what would you like to see happen to this? I mean, obviously, we've got a link on our website to the wrap photo essay that Sylvia put together, but is there plans? Would you like to have this become something like an exhibit of some kind that people could come and see themselves?
I think that there are a lot of opportunities here. First and foremost, you know, for an archivist, the two primary goals of ours are always preservation and access. So now, thanks to digitizing these files and being able to make them readily available for scholarship and for research, that's important. But I think a lot of the photos are just really have an artistic quality to them too, and they're very interesting. I could see exhibits happening. I do plan to talk with RAP more about things that we can be doing with that. But again, it's great that they're accessible to scholars and to researchers.
All right. Well, the full photo essay is called "The Missing Images of Early 20th Century Black Communities," and it can be viewed on the RAP website. As I said, we also have a link on our website. Mitch Heyman, archivist at the Ritz Theatre and Museum in LaVilla. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and thank you for listening. Thanks for everyone who called or commented. We encourage feedback and suggestions. You can send either to firstcoastconnect.org. There's a place there to submit comments or questions for future guests. You can also find all of our past and current shows. And while you're there, you can sign up for the First Coast Connect daily newsletter. Join us tomorrow when longtime prosecutor and current ABC News legal analyst Matt Murphy joins us to discuss his new memoir, The Book of Murder. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. Alchemy Yoga and Wellness, opening this summer in Ortega, offers a balanced approach to movement and recovery. Services include yoga, infrared sauna, cold plunge, massage, and facials in one location. More information at alchemyjacks.yoga.
This is WJCT News 80.